We're live. Welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Smith is not right this morning. I'm sorry.
We're having a good morning.
Hey, 10 days until the Keystone. 10. 10 days till the Keystone, 6 days till I submit my grades for fourth marking period in the year.
Oh, man.
6 days until I submit my grades for fourth marking period in the year, 10 days until the Keystone. Throwing it out there. Hey, who is here today? Erie? I'm not sure. Who's Erie? She said she switched her
Rosa.
account. Is it Rosa? Lauren. Hi, Rosa. Libby. Mackenzie. Ashlyn. Manny. Miguel. Daniel. Deanna. Reef. Cool.
That's a whole lot of your students.
It is.
Like one.
It's early. It's early days yet. Hey, so I think the idea today is to talk about evolution. We suggested looking at the questions in the Keystone Review packet before today. Although I'm not sure how much we're going to go over those. At some point in time, I will post an answer key to that packet for you if you're interested. If I'm submitting my grades, I'm just going to throw this out. If I'm submitting my grades on Thursday, and you want bonus points for having done the packet, you will want to show me the packet before Thursday. I think we've gone over every section but cell reproduction and genetics now.
Correct.
Okay. Emma in the house. Alex in the house. Cool. So that's the plan. We will check the sign-in roster for the live streams and look at that before we turn in grades. There'll be some bonus points for doing those things. But really, bonus points or not, it's in your best interest, right, to be prepared for the Keystones. Like, you don't go to take your permit test without studying. You know, you want to review for this because you don't want to have to jump through hurdles next year.
Agreed.
All right, here we go. You want to talk evolution, Mrs. Smith? Are we ready?
Let's talk evolution.
Do you know what worries me? It worries me that right now I see that we have 11 people viewing this. And it scares me to think that, like, the percentage of people that are going to go into this test without ever hearing this. I don't know. It doesn't matter what we say. They don't believe us. So here we go. Let's talk evolution. In the chat, could somebody in the chat please tell us or define for us evolution? In 3 words or less. Define evolution for us in 3 words or less.
3 words or less.
Sure.
That's 3 specific words because there's only one way that I can think of to explain it.
I don't know that you could do it in less than 3 words, but define it in 3 words if you can. If you want to use more, I guess we'll accept that. But
can I use a symbol?
I don't know. Libby just said change over time.
Because I could do this.
Here we go. So I want to start with that. Yeah, Libby, you are exactly right. I got to figure out how to change slides and do all this at one time. All right. You're exactly right. Lauren, species do adapt. All those things are good, but change over time is really the definition we want. And so you'll hear people, and I just want to get this out of the way. Mrs. Smith and I know we have to be careful because both of us really like this topic, and we could talk to you for hours and hours and hours about it, but we are going to try and be careful and keep it moving. But I have to start here. You're going to hear people say, I don't believe in evolution. That's like saying you don't believe in change over time, right? Because that's what it is. If you define evolution as change over time, you can almost say this is a fact. And I say that because I know some people get really upset about that. But I think if you listen to what we have to say today, you'll find that there's nothing to be upset about. Evolution is change over time. And we have seen organisms, specifically when we talk about life, and we have witnessed life change over time. We can give you really specific, concrete examples of things changing over time. Now, there's an evolutionary theory out there, and the theory discusses how we think this happens, why we think this happens, and maybe there's parts of the theory that you don't necessarily believe in or you question, but the fundamental change over time.
And remember, it is a theory. And in science, a theory means that there is evidence. So, you know what I mean? Like, I just want to make sure that we point that out and that we say, you know, too, there's nothing saying that you can't believe in religion and in evolution.
Right.
It's not really a debated topic amongst scientists on whether or not evolution exists. How, when, sure. But whether or not it exists is not a debated topic.
Right. And I think you made a really good point. They're not exclusive of each other. You can be an evolutionist and you can understand evolution, you can study evolution, and you can look at the theory. And you can still get up and go to church every Sunday morning or go to the mosque or go to, you know, whatever religion it is that you believe in. It has nothing to do, they're kind of separate of each other. So let's talk about this and like why it came to be. So if I put this guy in the chat real quick, who is this? All right, in the chat, quick, we got to go. I know there's a delay. In the chat, who is this gentleman? Wait. Me in 20 years, 50 years, 30 years. In the chat, who is it? And be ready because I'm going to ask you another question. In fact, yes, Libby, Darwin, great. One other really important figure in evolution. Who is this figure? All right, so Libby and Lauren, everybody got Darwin. Great, really, really quick. Can we change it up and tell me who this guy is?
You're making a funny Mr. Suter.
You think?
I feel like next year we should put a picture of you of when you first started teaching and see if they get it.
Who is this? Who is this wonderful gentleman here? This is Mrs. Smith's husband. Not waiting too much longer because we haven't seen too many things. And because it's a chat, we're trying to keep this moving. I'm just going to throw it out there. This is Darwin. And the reason I do this every time I talk about Darwin is I don't think that you guys can. Alfred Wallace Grace, that's a great guess, but that's not right. It is Darwin. Everybody sees this picture of Darwin and thinks of him as this old gray-haired dude, but this is the guy that really was traveling around the world. This is the guy that's closer to your age. This is the guy that questioned everything. This is, I think, a much more relatable guy. This is the guy that went to university and kind of dropped out because, you know, we don't have time to get into the whole story today. Didn't really like school at one point, you know. This is the guy I think you can relate to. And so, oh my gosh, it kills me that we can't tell the story, but he got on this little ship called the HMS Beagle. It was called a floating coffin because they're so small and most of them didn't come back and they sank. He made a promise to get on the ship and sail around the world. He went out, got on the ship, found out he got violently seasick the moment he stepped on this ship. So he spent like a year or two of his life seasick all the time in a cabin he couldn't stand up in cramped quarters, and he still did it. Why? Because he gave his word. You know, like when you say, "I promise I'll bring that work to you tomorrow, Mrs. Smith," and then you don't. Because you can't keep your word on your homework. He kept his word on traveling around the world in a boat that made him barf the entire time. Kind of the route, you know, they left, you know, and this is only important in that look at all the places they really stopped. So he kind of traveled around the world, and what he did, he was looking at life, collecting specimens. He actually mailed a lot of them back. He left like nobody really knew who he was. When he came back, he was pretty celebrated for just the work that he did while he was traveling. Galapagos Islands was one of the big spots. And while he was there, oh my gosh, Mrs. Smith, do you know how much it's killing me to just skip over all these stories? You have to start talking. While he was there, he saw finches. Why is that important, Mrs. Smith?
So finches are the big ones, but he saw a lot of different organisms there, and they all had similar things where he's like, I recognize these organisms, these animals, but they're different than they are on the mainland. And the other thing he noticed that there wasn't just one type, but there was multiple types within the same rather small island. And he started wondering, why are there all these different types of finches? Why are there multiple types of tortoises? Why are these things there? And he started kind of wondering how those things came to be and started kind of talking in his own head about these things. And Mr. Shooter and I had this conversation earlier that we just kind of tell you the facts about this and we talk about this as this happened a long time ago. But if Darwin himself was able to sit in this room and take biology class with you and learn the information that you did in a very here's the facts about it type of thing, his mind would be blown every single day because he's noticing all these things without having any backing before this point. He's the first one that's kind of noticing things about these different areas.
And what's really interesting, in his world, things didn't change. The Bible said things didn't change. The church at the time, and the church at the time, at his time, is much different than the church at your time. And we'll leave it at that. But they said things didn't change. So in his diary, he wrote, I'm beginning to suspect that organisms change. And that was almost like heresy. That would make you a pariah. That would make you somebody that society would shun. That thought. And so when we tell you, you can't even comprehend or imagine or start to feel how uncomfortable this would be. How uncomfortable that kind of thinking was for somebody at that time. But you know what the interesting thing is? Why everybody was afraid to admit or didn't want to say that things changed, they were changing them.
Anybody own a dog? Because if you own a dog or somebody that owns a dog, that dog was bred from a wolf at one point or another. We actually did this. We kept the wolves that were the tamest and then kept the puppies of those that were the tamest. And then we kept the puppies of those that were the tamest until we started ourselves creating new species of our dogs. And we still do that.
Like the golden doodle, right? We need a dog that you're not allergic to.
Right.
We'll retrieve. So we breed, we select what traits we breed for.
And so this is called artificial selection. I'm a fan of vegetables, but I
want to hurt this person. He ruined many dinners as a child. My mom wouldn't let me leave the table until I ate some of that stuff. Whoever is responsible for that needs to be, never mind, I'm sorry.
But, everything from Brussels sprouts to cabbage to kale to broccoli to cauliflower, all of those actually come from a wild mustard plant. If you think about if you like any of almonds or peanuts or cashews, all of those actually came from a plant that was poisonous. The only naturally growing nut that you should consume is an acorn. And they're not very pleasant, and they usually have a lot of bugs in them. But naturally, that's, we kind of changed to get food and things that we want, and we still do that. We artificially select for chickens to make them larger. We're not going to talk about the hormones that they get, but, we artificially select for, all of our food products. So we as humans have done this.
Yeah, show me a wild cow.
You know what I mean? I really find it interesting that we say, there's people that say, no, no, no. And they're the same people that are consuming all of these things and have pets.
Yeah. And so with that in mind, Darwin sits back and he's like, wow, if we can do this, if we can select for traits, if we can select for web feed on a Labrador retriever so it's a better swimmer, if we can select for dogs to be really small so they can hunt rats, could nature do the same thing? And so now he's going, I'm beginning to suspect things change. But not only that, I think there's a mechanism or a way or something that helps that along. And so that's where he comes up with this idea of adaptations, right? Starts to look at, I guess we go to adaptations. I was thinking it was a different slide for a minute. Start looking at adaptations. So we can run through some, like this head of an owl. That the size of the skull on that owl is just about the size of the white in the feathers. The feathers around the skull create this radar dish. I mean, literally, it's a radar dish, right? That it can turn its head and use it to funnel sound into its ear canals so it can zoom in on a mouse running underneath of leaves at night and leap out of a tree and catch that mouse. It's an adaptation to its environment. Feet of birds, webbed for swimming, claws for grasping. You know, I'm not going to get into all of them because we're out of time, but you can see, depending on the environment of the bird's foot would be a little bit different. The kiwi has a very long nose and actually has nostrils at the end of its nose. Typically, nostrils would be back closer to the head, but this is because the kiwi sticks its nose down in the ground looking for insects, not to mention the color of the bird and everything else. All right, so Mrs. Smith, since I did the adaptations, do you want this? I'm giving over favorite parts, right?
So, when we started looking at adaptations that certain organisms had, and Darwin started thinking about, okay, so if an adaptation is more favorable, then we're going to see that particular organism survive, compete for resources, and then pass those traits over to their offspring. Now, we know way more about genetics and genes than he ever did. And so we kind of now understand, if you remember from our unit that we've been studying with meiosis and DNA and how DNA is passed in chromosomes from mom and dad, and they join together in order to form the full number. And so you have characteristics from both, and then you have phenotypes that are displaying because of whether or not you have dominant or recessive alleles and all that stuff. And so, but just this even general idea that if a characteristic is favorable, then it makes sense that we're going to continue to see that, because those organisms that have the favorable adaptations are going to survive. The only thing I do want to point out is that a characteristic that is an adaptation is a random mutation that happens to be favorable. Evolution doesn't occur because we're striving for something. We can't wish to have gills so that we can survive in the water if the polar ice caps all melt and land is covered. It would be that someone happened to have that mutation, that it is favorable. And so a lot of times you hear natural selection called survival of the fittest. And, I've really, in my higher level classes, started talking about survival of the good enough. Because if it's good enough for you to get resources and it's good enough for you to survive and pass on to your offspring, then it's good enough for you to survive. And so we're going to continue to see that characteristic be passed on. Anything to add about? Do you want to talk about the moths on the side?
Yeah, I don't think we have to get into that, other than, this idea that nature's figured it out, right? Make more than you need, make sure they're different, and then as things get selected for, the ones that are best suited for the environment. Best suited for the environment, because what you think is best might not be the best suited for the environment, right? And so we've talked a little bit when we did ecology, and when you did ecology with Mr. Bickley, you talked about niches and how niches can overlap. And that's a really important thing, because when things leave, like when all the dinosaurs died, imagine dinosaurs probably took up all these niches, right? They had all these roles in the environment. When they were wiped out, all of a sudden there was new niches, places that had not been exploited. And if you had a trait, if you were an organism and you had a trait that could exploit that niche, that could go in there and be like, I'm going to use that new niche open to you, and then led to probably some more natural selection. I don't know, getting too deeper than we need to get, I guess, maybe. But moving on, here's one thing I do want to mention. There's microevolution, macroevolution, and speciation. And so here's the place where people go, I don't believe in evolution. Well, think about this for a second. Speciation is when we have a group of, we're going to dumb this down, right? We have a group of organisms that can all breed and have offspring. Something happens. Mrs. Smith's going to probably talk about what that something might be here in a second. Something happens and they no longer breed together. They're now separate species. They don't have offspring anymore. That's speciation. That is something we see a lot. You can watch it happen in the world today. We don't have to look at history to see it. We see it happening all the time. Microevolution is changes within species. So speciation would probably be kind of like a microevolution, but a bird is still a bird, or a reptile is still a reptile, or a bacteria is still a bacteria. Macroevolution is the idea that we get to when we say reptiles gave rise to birds, reptiles gave rise to mammals, amphibians gave rise to reptiles, fish gave rise to amphibians. That's the spot. Those big leaps when a bird became a reptile or a fish became an amphibian are the place that people have problems with. And because of that problem, they go, well, I don't believe or understand any of it. And what we're trying to show you is get over that problem. All right? Focus on maybe the microevolution, speciation. But look at the evidence. We're going to show you a whole bunch of evidence if we don't talk too much. And I'm starting to. So Mrs. Smith, I think, do you want to tell them how that can happen?
So quickly, what we wanted to look at is something called a phylogenetic tree. So there's a couple of different types of evolutionary trees. There's a phylogenetic tree and there's something called a cladogram. And all of them show characteristics that are common and in turn show evolutionary history. Specifically, a phylogenetic tree is going to also show some time, and it's going to show where there are differences. These do change as we get new evidence, but essentially it's just showing common ancestors and common traits on things. And so if you're looking at this one that's there, it shows you how different, a bird might be. How many different times have we seen changes between that and like seaweed? So that's what a phylogenetic tree is. And so when we talk about speciation, when we talk about forming new species, we talk about things called isolating mechanisms. Essentially, what's going to cause something to be isolated and not be able to reproduce, because that's how we get new species. It's not necessarily the changes. If we just have changes within a population, different adaptations that are favorable, we increase the biodiversity, which is great. Lots of different things, like the human population. Okay, we have tons of different traits that are in there. The more we have, the more biodiversity, the better off we are as a species as a whole. But when we have something that prevents then a viable offspring, and you have two things that start to separate and they no longer can reproduce and produce viable offspring, then we get speciation. Three of the big ones are on this: temporal isolation, behavioral isolation, and geographical. Geographical one is honestly the ones I've seen a lot on the Keystone, which taught, or sample Keystone questions that says like, oh, this salamander and this salamander got separated from a mountain range. They could no longer meet to interbreed, so they cause different species. Well, good, they can't get to one another. Okay, behavioral isolation, they can be in the same area, but essentially there is something that prevents them from mating. Maybe the bird is not making the right call. That's why the music note's there. Because a lot of it has to do with those courtship things. Not the right song, doesn't have the correct bright colors, doesn't do the correct dance or motion in order to want to produce offspring. And then temporal isolation is that, maybe there's two different types of skunks, Western and Eastern spotted skunks. One is going to reproduce in the fall to winter, and one's going to be in the spring to summer. So time of year prevents them from reproducing. So those are three big isolating mechanisms, but there's also the fact that some don't produce viable offspring. So like you could talk about a hybrid species, like a tigon or a liger, which is the result of a tiger and a lion. We have to remember in normal world, that's geographically isolated. They are not in the same area. But if they are able to interbreed, and they can because they have this similar number of chromosomes, but their offspring cannot then breed with that hybrid to create more of those offspring. So you have some of that to deal with. And again, we're trying to cut each other short. I could talk about this for like 2 days, but in other words, there's things that don't allow them to reproduce, whether it's before the actual reproduction or having viable offspring afterwards.
One of the things that Mrs. Smith said that jumped out at me that I just want to mention, just maybe in light of times, that genetic diversity is good, right? Genetic diversity is good. Diversity in organisms is good. The more diverse you are, the better you are to withstand major changes in the environment. And if you look at people from all around the world, we see a lot of genetic diversity, whether it's in skin color, hair color, whatever. And all of those things are simply good. But when we look at people's DNA, and if you take the DNA between two people that have maybe very different outward appearances, you'll find their DNA is the same. Very, very similar. In fact, from their DNA, you can't tell what color a person is. Just when look, I mean, I guess if you could read the code, maybe you could. But, the difference in our DNA and our genetics, the idea of a human race, like this race of human and this race of human, there's no such thing. So to be a racist, you have to be pretty uneducated and not understand what it is that makes us different. And actually why it's good. So anyway, that's my little soapbox. Moving on. Sorry. Evidence for evolution. We're going to do this quick, right, Mrs. Smith? Here we go.
Ready.
Physiological resistance. If you spray pesticides on a field, you will kill most of the insects that eat our plants and our crops. If you do that over and over the years, eventually you will have insects that can drink your pesticides like it's a cocktail and it's no big deal. If you take penicillin for every bacterial infection, eventually penicillin won't work. In fact, most of our antibiotics no longer work against the bacteria we're fighting, and that is more scary than a lot of the problems we talk about on a daily basis. Things become resistant. Why? Because the ones that are able to survive do. Survival of the fittest or the good enough. Next, we'll go back and forth.
So fossil evidence. So this is essentially looking at similarities in fossils and also finding those linked fossils. Again, I could talk about this for hours, but, we're imagining that there's something in between, sea animals and land animals, and it's just a hypothesis. And then it's like, oh my gosh, we found Tiktaalik. It's like a magic in-between fossil. So there is fossil evidence that supports that we've had even macroevolutionary changes.
Geography. This one, I don't know if we really need to get into that one. It has to do with land masses and how close they are. Like how, if you think back in time, all the continents were once a big landmass, and we can look at animals that were, marsupials is always like a great example. If you think about like kangaroos and stuff that have pouches, but we also have some of those in North America, but not many anymore. And you can trace everything kind of back to one spot, and it's beautiful. And it's a really intense, awesome thing. I took a class called Evolutionary Biogeography one time. That was amazing. But we only have 10 seconds for it today.
This big one goes back kind of to fossils, but specifically talks about homologous structures. So if you're in genetics, which you should be, and you're learning about homozygous, we talk about the same alleles, whether it's homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive. Homologous are the same bones that might be used, so same structures that might be used for different purposes. So they love to show this picture of the human, the cat, the whale, and the bat, and show you how they have the same bone structure. It might look a little bit different, but we have the same bones, but they are done for different purposes. Versus, I'm sorry, I'm going to go to the next slide. that talks about analogous structures. So these are all the same purpose, but the structures are different. So different structures, but for the same purpose. So talking like the wing of a butterfly versus the wing of the bat, the structure itself is very different, but they are both used for flight. And so these kind of go into specifics on whether we talk about things like divergent evolution and convergent evolution, which again, I could spend days on, but I'll be quiet.
Yeah, those eyeballs or the eyeball of a human and the eyeball of, I believe, like an octopus, which would have developed at very different times, but have developed to be very similar because they have a similar purpose. Vestigial structures. This is a really cool one. So vestigial structures are evolutionary leftovers. Why do we have things that don't have a purpose? So at the top of your ear, you have a little thing called a Darwin's turnbuckle. I think that's how you say it, Darwin's turnbuckle. The chimpanzee has one of those. That muscle was there to be able to move your ear so you could zero your ears in to hear better. I've never seen you guys sitting in class doing this, trying to follow me around the room. Goosebumps. You know, when you get scared, you get your goosebumps stand up, or you get cold, your goosebumps stand up. You know, if you were completely covered in fur and that happened, your fur would puff out. Have you ever seen a dog do that where they get freaked out, all the hair on the back stand up? Same thing. Evolutionary leftover. You don't use that anymore, but you still have them. Some of the most famous ones, or the whale. If you dissect a whale, you'll find a pelvis bone and a femur. It does not have back legs or hip. You know, it doesn't have a reason for those. But whales are thought to have first been on land and through evolution had returned to the sea and lost those back legs. If you dissect a snake, if you get a ball python and you look at the tail of a ball python, there'll be two little hooks. Those little hooks, if you follow them back, same thing. Those will join into the skeleton very much in the same way as the whale, like the pelvis and the hip bones and stuff like that. But obviously, snakes don't have back legs. Your appendix. Just keep going, right? Your appendix. What is that for? What's it good for? Nothing. That's why they take it out when you know, whatever.
Embryology is the study of looking at embryos. And so as we look at the embryos of several different species here, we all have similar patterns of how they develop. And so my phone is ringing. So give me a second, Mr. Shooter, take over.
Yeah. So how embryos, so look, we don't need to dive into this other than I hope you can see at the top, it says lizard, tortoise, pig, and a human. And if you look at the embryo, the very early embryo of a lizard, tortoise, pig, and a human, they all look very similar. They all have these gill slits, pharyngelial gill slits or whatever. They all have tails. And then as they develop, you see them start to diverge a little bit more. We could talk more about this, but the thing here isn't that like we can see what we were in an old embryo, but the thing is that we can see this kind of very similar development in all the embryos. And then I think the last thing, and the one that Mrs. Smith and I probably like the most because you have seen it throughout the class, is biochemistry. You know, we've talked about the 4 major organic molecules. We've talked about, you know, how they are built and how they're made and how they work and where we find them in cell membranes. And we've talked about cells, and we've talked to everything has applied to every organism on Earth. So it's those relatedness things, like how are things related? You are related to a bacteria cell because you have a cell membrane, cytoplasm, and DNA.
That's all made of the same nucleotide bases.
Right.
So
so there's this huge connection or connectiveness through life. And I mean, we're in 34 minutes here, Mrs. Smith, so I don't know if we have time for anything else, but this is the stuff that blew my mind. The embryology, the vestigial structures, the analogous, the that picture right there when I was your age totally floored me and blew my mind. Like, why are the same bones and all of these things? And if your mind blown about any of this, you know, that's why you start to study it and you think about it, because it really is amazing. You're mind blown about the new game on your iPhone, maybe. But this is bigger than that, right? This is like, wow, how does this all fit together? It's that question of life. And It's really amazing to think about and to look at. It's a study. So what do you think, Mrs. Smith?
I think it's 35 minutes.
Yes.
And it's probably
beat him up. Yeah, it's probably time to go. Any question? I mean, if you have a quick question, do this. A quick question. We'll give like 30 seconds for you to catch up. If there's any quick questions on anything we talked about, throw them in the chat real quick. We thought about playing a game. We went longer. We left out so much and went longer than we planned to. It's really crazy, but it's such a cool subject. The thing is, you've been studying evolution all year long. Because this is, and the one thing to take into the Keystone with you is, this is the thread that ties all biology together. You can't study biology without having an understanding of evolution and how things are connected and why, it's that thread that runs through it all.
This is it, Grace.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is pretty much it.
Well, except like Mr. Shear said, we've really been teaching you all of the evidence throughout the year.
Yeah.
Going back and talking about, well, it doesn't matter what organism you are. It all connects. If you think even that question was on the biotech web quest, the very last question said, about pretty much answering that question, what's the difference? Well, it's the order of the DNA that makes a difference between organisms. I know it's so very fascinating.
We would love, guaranteed, we would love to talk about it for a lot longer. Because, and then any of these subjects we've talked about, like you get into the isolating factors. You could spend a month, you could teach a class just on isolating mechanisms that lead to evolution.
Who doesn't want to talk about the wall fin?
We just, if you like it,
the zonkey.
The zonkey. Or just like, can we just go with a mule? Because mules are.
Well, and then you start to talk about the DNA, though. That is, how does that happen? Why are they sterile? Oh, because they have an odd number of chromosomes. So if they form gametes and you can't really half that, it's not going to work.
Yeah. So much cool stuff. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this was one of the few live streams where we didn't have a game or didn't try to go over questions or whatever, but we wanted to give you as much time as we could on just trying to think about what some of these evidences are, think about what we've talked in class, and start pulling things together in your mind. Take that with you. Evolution is kind of the glue that ties everything that we've talked about together. And if you start to think about how DNA works, how cell reproduction works, how genetics works, it all starts to make sense.
And just to re-emphasize, for the Keystone, if you're like, if you don't use your scrap paper, like you should, you know what I mean? Go in there, brain dump material when you walk into the test, create those graphic organizers. You have as much time as you want. And I know that it's the last week of school and it's going to be like, I don't really want to be there, but take the time to do it and to go through and really, you know what I mean? Try your hardest.
Are you trying to say do it right the first time so you don't have to do it again?
Gosh, that was it.
That's what you're trying to say. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, have a wonderful day. Thanks for joining us. We will talk to you later.
Monday.
Yeah, Monday. 10 days.